All right, we're here today with Anne Lamott, the author of Grace Eventually, Thoughts on Faith. This is your third book in this sort of series of books on faith. You keep coming back to this idea with occasional sojourns into fiction. What is it that brings you back to these vignettes, these short vignettes on faith?
Well, when I used to teach writing, which I haven't for a while, I used to always tell my students to write what they would love to come upon, so that by doing so they could make it exist in the world. And I love coming upon short essays on faith, like C.S. Lewis's I really love a lot. And I would love to have been able to come upon other pieces of faith during the worst times in my life, like having a tiny infant and having not having an owner's manual and having lost the receipt and just feeling generally hopeless a lot. I would have loved to have come upon some essays by people that were really telling the truth and saying, you know what, it can be a mixed bag. Same with writing. I like the format of these short takes and bird by bird, because I would have loved for someone to tell me the truth and say, if you get published, you're not going to be made whole by it. You're going to be more mentally challenged than you already are, you know. And I would have loved for people to say, this might work if you're completely stuck, you know, don't bother with this. So I write the books that I would be relieved to find. So I love the shape of the essays, which is to say 1,500, 2,000 words. They're kind of the same story. I wake up, I'm in a funk, or I'm worried about stuff. I'm kind of a worried person with a lot of faith, and which you're allowed to be, it turns out. And I get up and something happens and throws me. It's hard being a parent. It's hard being an American and a human, and stuff goes wrong. And then against all odds, the plates of the earth shift and things turn around. And that's mostly what my stories are about. That's how I experience life.
Yeah, you say, I mean, the title, Grace Eventually, in parentheses, I mean, obviously the eventually is a really big part. I mean, you say that help is always on the way.
Always.
And 100% of the time. I mean, how can you, and as you talk to people, how can you be so absolutely certain that it's always coming?
Well, I can say that in my life, 100% of the time, even when I've been at my most forlorn and scared, when I have asked for help, it has arrived. Let me tell you that great joke from Grace Eventually, which I really think explains all of Grace for me. It's about the pilot who crashes in the tundra, and he's lying broken and banged up and bruised, freezing to death in a broken plane, just praying and praying every day for several days. And then he finally, when he comes to, he's in a hospital room surrounded by his family, and they're saying, thank God, thank God. He says, don't mention God to me. I prayed for 3 days and nothing happened. And they said, but you're here and you're going to be okay. And he said, yeah, because some stupid Eskimos came along. And so for me, I think who we are Eskimos for one another. That God, as I understand God, does not have a magic wand. And when you pray for strength or patience, or you pray for patience and you end up in a traffic jam, right? Because I think that's God with his or her quirky sense of humor. It's God as coyote trickster. But there's no magic wand, and God is not a cosmic bellhop. And so, but eventually, an Eskimo will arrive.
So this idea of grace is an idea that obviously goes throughout the entire book, and grace takes on a lot of different forms, whether it's an Eskimo or it's some act of faith or some really poignant moment. They're all different types of grace in this book. So I guess I'd ask you, how do you define grace? It's a warm, beautiful word, but what does it mean to you, the word grace?
Well, it took me a whole book to sort of get to what little I can articulate about it. But there's one story in which I'm a catastrophically awful but enthusiastic skier, and I end up in a very, very small room with really sort of humiliated and out of breath and scared. And the woman who had found me and brought me to this little shed, first of all had said to me, let me give you my glasses, my mittens. Mine are warm and toasty and yours are wet. And she took them off. And so just for someone to give me their warm toasty mittens, that's like such an Eskimo thing to do. And then she was warming mine up on a kerosene heater, and then she went off, and the kerosene smelled awful. And then I realized there was this little ribbon of very clean mountain air getting in through some of the cracks in the walls. And it was Northern California, so it's just all pine trees and evergreens, and so it just smelled like heaven. It was just a ribbon though, and it was all I needed to get over my claustrophobia and my stuckness. There's other stories where in usually I have to surrender and give up on having any more good ideas to experience grace, because as long as you think you're in control and that your ideas are good ideas, it's hard to just stop this forward thrust, but once you fall down on your butt or something and you give up, then all sorts of funny things start to happen. Almost always somebody will arrive, help you get up, dust off your butt and point you in the right direction. That's why I always go to the Special Olympics, because that's the purest demonstration of that you'll ever see, is that no one sits in the dust.
Yeah.
I mean, the other athletes at the Special Olympics, if someone's sitting in the dust, run back and come and get him or her, so. But in some of my stuckness, what I experience is a little extra buoyancy. I would say it's divine help in the form of feeling like I'm not actually going to go down after all, that I have water wings on. I have some kind of crummy water wings from Walgreens or something, and it's enough. It doesn't seem like it should be enough to, when you're up against the ocean, but that grace is that it is enough, and you start to go, I'm sort of semi-okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's the thing I think that connects so well with everyone. You really come at this from an everyday place. There's so many insecurities that you put out there for people to see. So many of your own concerns about your own body image or your weight or your age. I think you call yourself 4011 at one point.
No, I'm 4013.
You're 4013. Congratulations.
Thank you.
I mean, that to me is obviously so real, but it's also probably surprising to some that here's a person who's achieved so much, you've touched so many, and yet you still struggle with these same insecurities. And your son, when he grabbed your face and said, I love this little face, and yet you didn't feel that way yourself.
Well, I think it's really hard to grow up as an American female, for one thing, and I'm not sure if it's as hard for men, but from very, very early on, kindergarten really, there is a way that you're supposed to be. There's only really one way for American girls to be. If you're a tomboy, it's kind of okay till you reach the cutoff line, which is like 9, 10. Then it's terrifying for the adults. And so, and in my case, I had this funny crinkly, crankly hair, Sam called it once, and I had crinkly, crunkly hair, and I was really, really skinny, and I was a year younger because I skipped a grade. And I just always felt other. When I've read the Bible and I've read the phrase about being a stranger in a strange land, I always I grokked it, to quote the great Robert Heinlein. It turned out in my 20s, I discovered everyone had felt that way. Even the girls that the women that had been really pretty girls, everybody was going around comparing their insides and their vulnerabilities and their fearfulness about themselves to everybody else's outsides. Because on our outsides, you burnish the surface and you cover up the stains or the spots or the bumps, and you present this surface to the world. And what I've tried to get to in my work is like who we are without the armor on and without the makeup. And so I do wish God had a magic wand and I could pray that this self-consciousness would just be gone. But God doesn't seem to, and so it's little by little by little. I feel like I had a 55-gallon drum of misperception about myself, because I never thought I was beautiful or pretty or anything, and it's like one day at a time, because of incredibly loving friends and a few great movies and several musicians who you just feel are total, not just Eskimos, but maybe Eskimo angels. It's like you get to keep taking out a tablespoon of it, half of a cup sometimes, and you hear the right song and you just go, I am so back, and you take out some more. And so I think it's a lifelong process. I can tell you I'm about 80% less self-conscious than I was. I think I have really grown into being this strangely beautiful woman. And yet when I was getting ready to come here tonight, when I saw my thighs in the shower in this bright daylight of Ann Arbor, I went, so one day at a time and all that, bird by bird and all that.
The same concept applies to your mothering skills and you as a mother, and that's been something that I know in all of your books has really been one of the parts of your books that people love best. I mean, it's maybe when Anne Lamott is at her best, when she's writing about being a mother. Your son is how old now?
17 and a half.
Sam is 17.
Yeah, he's graduated from high school. He's moved out.
Yeah.
Yeah, he's studying in Washington. He's studying carpentry, firefighting, and poetry. Having a child is just so humbling, because you have been raised reading Little Women, for instance, was probably my favorite book when I was a child. And I thought when I was a mother, became a mother, I'd be more like Marmee, who's the mother in Little Women, you know, and I'd be more elegant, and I'd always have a solution. And then I've heard people say it's not our problems that are the problem, it's our solutions that are the problem. And my solutions, my first default reactions to problems that came up were worse than the problems. And what was the solution was telling the truth, and was asking other people, please tell me the truth, what you do with a colicky child. You know, I know you're not supposed to put them outside for a night all bundled up so you can get one night's sleep. I intuitively know that. And yet having a child puts you in touch with feelings I didn't believe I'd had. I didn't know I was such an angry person till I was 35. I didn't know how brainwashed I'd been too. I mean, when I was 35, I also discovered B+s were a good grade. And my whole college life, I had, in elementary school, everything, B+, the response was, Annie, it's good, but how much harder would it have been to get an A-? But the catch was that if you got the A-, it's like, it's really good, honey, but how much harder? So there's a book out now, I don't know who wrote it, called A Good Enough Mother. And I think the most radical thing that happened for me was when I had a tiny baby and I was single and I didn't have any money and I was a freelance writer. And a few women told me that we were all in the same soup. And whether you had a partner or whether you had we didn't have a nursery. I mean, he didn't have his own room. And they said it really doesn't matter. It's all sort of academic at some point because it's hard and it's fantastic. It's beautiful. You could die of love, and it's a mixed grill. And maybe about the 8th hour of being with a child alone on a rainy day might just be ever so slightly boring. You know, you might get just a touch of cabin fever. So the truth that other women gave to me was what I wanted to share, which was to say, just relax, you know what I mean? Let go. It's hard to let go, you know, as a parent, and I've always said everything I let go of has claw marks on it, but let go of the perfectionism. Same thing I would recommend to writers, to people who want to write, let go of the perfectionism. It will only make you crazy. And Sam, boy, he has humbled me. He is so funny too. I mean, last year, 2 years ago when I wrote Plan B, he realized he was suddenly much taller than I am, and he patted me on the head and said, "You've become like a little gnome to me, Mom." But then most recently, what's been wonderful is he's discovered all my work, not just the Sam stories, which he's always loved, and which I've always run by him. So for obvious reasons, I don't want to write anything that would. Fan, though. Yeah. But he always read the Sam stories. Then in high school, I became less of an embarrassment because the students were assigned bird by bird. So, and the teachers thought it was a cool book. So that was like, you know, it's my mom and that's me. I'm the
Mom's
Sam.
hip again.
But he called about 3 weeks ago, and he just read the first novel, All New People, and he said, "You know, Mom, you're really good." And I said, "Oh, well, thanks, honey." Yeah. And then he said, "This is great. It's like having my own private tribal elder."
I love Sam.
He's cool.
Well, thank you. I really appreciate you taking the time.
Oh, you're so welcome.
I'm really looking forward to seeing you tonight.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Yeah, thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, Anne Lamott.
Thank you. Thank you for coming, especially on such short notice. And I didn't know what to expect, but I'm glad to be here. And don't worry if your kids make little sounds or do anything that would be annoying, which they probably will, but it won't annoy me. I'm just so relieved when it's not my child making the interruptive sounds. And I really love having children here. I really prefer it. So I think I'll do what I always do, which is to read something, and then I'm really happy to take your questions. I've been on tour for a month. This is my last night on the road, and I'm in a kind of borderline ecstasy. But it's this kind of odd combination of being completely fried and burnt out and incompetent, but mingled, marbled together with this ecstatic trance that I get to go home tomorrow. But there's nowhere I'd rather be tonight than here, except for home. I'm just going to go ahead and read this, and I'll tell you about the book. And I'll tell you about the book. It's the third in the collection of faith pieces. The first one I wrote when Bill Clinton was president, and I was in a better mood. And it was called Traveling Mercies. And I really thought that every single thing I knew about faith ordinary faith of non-denominational that had to do with being a mother, being a daughter, being a human, being an American. I just sort of shoehorned it all in, like I did when I wrote Bird by Bird, where I put in everything that I could think of that might be useful to anyone at some point. But then what happened was that then George Bush became president, and I became somewhat more tense. And a lot of the people that were around me were extremely tense. And so I was partly writing to help people keep their sense of buoyancy and keep their spirits up and not lose faith. And I was writing about keeping the faith in really, really difficult circumstances. Now I'm in a good mood again. But a lot has happened. My mother has died and about 4 or 5 years ago, and I've written some pieces about how that has affected our relationship, which has actually been an improvement. But I actually have a very deep love and missing of her now, and that it was pretty hard. She was this little, willful, mad little English woman, you know, with a glint in her eye and this sort of combination of low self-esteem and imperiousness. And so I've always thought there should be 12-step groups for the children of the English. But my son became a teenager. My son is now 17 and a half. I know it's sort of shocking for some of you because he was frozen in the amber of the cover of, what was it called? You know, Operating Instructions, right? Where he's about 8 months old wearing a tiger suit from Mervyn's. And, but that was 17 years ago. And he's graduated from high school. He's just the love of my life. He's just a wonderful, he's studying up in Washington State. He's studying all the stuff that I released him from having to come to church at 15 and said, just go, you know, see what you see and come to believe whatever you come to believe, or don't land on anything and just keep taking it in and, you know, talking with people and go wherever you're led. And then when he went off to college, he got very, very interested in firefighting, which I love because it's such a beautiful way to give back what was so freely given to you as an American, for one thing, which is safety and like incredible people to protect you and put out fires for you and rescue you and your animals. So he's also studying poetry, which he just loves. And I foist all the poetry on him that I love. But then I give him the token talk on how he has to find his own way to the poetry he loves. But then I foist Mary Oliver on him and Sharon Olds and Auden. And he's quite tall. And people always want to know how he feels about being written about, because I'm writing about him since I was pregnant with him. And he... since he's been about 12, I've always showed him everything I've written and to get some sort of editorial clearance. And also because I'm not stupid, and this is a society based on litigation. And so and there's a piece in here that's really painful. It was a painful experience in our life about a year ago when I crossed a line I swore I would never cross, and I slapped him. And I showed him the piece because he has just always said, it would be so great for other mothers if you could tell them what we go through, because somehow we always come to the other side. And so I showed it to him, and he handed it back contemptuously and said, "You can only use this if you look as bad as I do." And so I wrote, and I really do. I mean, I thought I did, but he was up in Washington State with me because he goes to school there, and he met me in Seattle when I was on book tour there a few weeks ago. And we did this huge event. I mean, I did this huge store and there were like 800 people. And I asked Sam to come up and say hi, because people come up to me and say, "We've loved him and been pulling for him since you told us about him." And so Sam got like a bigger ovation than I did. And then afterwards, everybody wanted him to sign their books too. So that was nice. When he was younger, when he was like 9 and 10 and 11, he used to come to book signings with me, and he would autograph Operating Instructions for $0.25. He used to just make a fortune. I remember once at Davis, UC Davis, he made $17, you know. What a huckster. So that's my boy. And now he's discovered the non-Sam stories, because he's always read the Sam stories. And he's so funny because he's really proud of me. He can't believe like I'm really good at something, because around the house I'm not good at anything. You know, I'm terrible on the computer. I don't really cook. I'm more of a hunter-gatherer, and I always was. And the one thing I'm really good at is have a good ear for a story. And I learned the habit of writing from my father, that you sit down every day by prearrangement with yourself. You don't wait for inspiration, or you won't get anything done ever. You sit down at the same time so that your unconscious knows to kick in, you know, looks at its little watch and says, oh, for God's sake, is it 9? And I sit down and I write really, really short assignments. I try to make things small and manageable. I keep a 1-inch picture frame by my desk so I can remember I don't have to know what I'm doing. No writer really knows what he or she is doing until there's a first draft. And I let myself write really awful drafts. And people always think I must be just being nice and saying, oh, mine are awful too. But I mean it, mine are awful, awful. And they'll be like on an essay that's like 8 to 10 pages, they'll be 16 pages long. And they'll be really overwrought. And I will have put in a whole bunch of stuff that I think makes me look more erudite or spiritually evolved. And I'll have all these weird tangents. You know, it'll be a piece about like the skiing accident I'm going to read you about. But somehow I will have worked in this kind of critical analysis of the dresses that the Nixon girls wore when they got married at the White House. And I learned along the way that half of creativity is taking stuff out. I take a lot of stuff out. And anyway, so Sam has discovered I can do this one thing really well, and then his friends think it's really cool. His friends like my story, and if you have 16, 17, 18-year-old kids, you know you get a lot of credit if their colleagues don't think you're a complete loser. So anyway, he's doing really well. So actually in Sacramento, I was at a Borders in Sacramento on Monday, and I did my own question and answer because people sometimes feel a little shy about questions. So I said, oh, well, I'll just do it. So I said, well, how is Sam doing? And then I said, well, he's doing very, very well. He's up in one. And I told the story, and then I said, tell me, how does he feel about being written about? And then, how is writing fiction different from writing nonfiction? It was very efficient. But I'll let you think of your own questions tonight. I'm very happy to sign, no matter how many books you have, no matter how old they are, no matter if you've dropped them in bathtubs. I signed one, there's one, and they get wide, they get real thick, like James Joyce, Ulysses. I signed one last night that had been driven over by a car and looked like it. I've read books where the dog actually has chewed to pieces. So I'll really sign anything, but you have to put your own names, and you can put little endearments, and I'll sign that. You can put to Francine, who has helped me so much along the way, and I'll sign that. So this is a piece from Grace Eventually called Ski Patrol. Not too long ago, I was skiing in the mountains where my son Sam and I spend a weekend most winters. Nowadays, he instantly disappears with the hordes of snowboarders. I believe he is somewhat embarrassed to be seen with me. Once, standing next to him and his friend at the bottom of a hill, I fell over for no reason. And in fact, the very first time we went skiing together, I skied in a strangely slow, inexorable path for 100 feet or so, straight into a huge net at the bottom of the slopes, erected to protect the small ski bear children from being crushed by people like me. Then I got tangled up in it like a fish. After Sam disappears, I usually take the chairlift to the top of the pony slope for a couple of runs, which anyone can manage, and I triumph. I roar down the slight incline, pretending to be an Olympic skier. Filled with confidence, I try the easiest intermediate slope, where I mostly fall or slide down on my butt for the first run, and then have an extended run of 4 or 5 minutes where I am actually skiing. By my second run down an intermediate slope, I am on my feet almost the entire time, skiing triumphantly for America. But this time, as the chairlift carried me to the top of the intermediate slope, which I had just skied down, I experienced a moment's confusion, born of hormones, high altitude, and a light snow falling. I suddenly could not remember whether the stop we were approaching was the same one I had just skied down from. The chair slowed and lowered for us to disembark, and my seatmate got off and zipped away like a swallow, while I sat there torn between wanting to get off and thinking that mine was the next stop. The chair jerked forward and resumed its ascent. I looked around for landmarks, but saw only brightly colored skiers in clusters, and I was pretty sure that this was not the right stop. Until a second later, when I realized I was mistaken, it was definitely the right stop. By then, though, the chair was 4 or 5 feet off the ground and rising, but I did not let this stop me. I took a long, deep breath, wriggled to the edge of the chair, and flung myself off into the snow. Flung myself the way stuntmen fling themselves onto the backs of speeding trains. I estimate that I was 5 or 6 feet off the ground for the timeless instant of eternity before I crashed down into the snow. I landed hard, proving the theory of gravity once and for all. I was somehow still on my skis for a moment until I fell over. I do not imagine anyone had seen anything like this before. Someone hurtling into outer space with such force from such a low starting point. I felt like Icarus near death in the snow with melting skis instead of wings. I was immediately aware of 2 things: that I was not badly hurt, and that most people were pretending not to have noticed. I am ever my mother's daughter, and so my first impulse was to smile with confidence to the few people who were watching, and then wave like a politician campaigning from the rarely used horizontal position. I'm okay, I assured the two pretty women who came over and offered to pull me up. I continued to wave nonchalantly, as if this sort of silly thing happened to me all the time. I told them that I just needed to catch my breath. They made sympathetic cooing sounds and skied away. I sat up and leaned back on my hands in the snow for a while. By the time I finally stood up, my hands were frozen. I was winded, ashamed, confused, and bruised, grateful only that Sam hadn't seen me. He would have died. He would have stabbed himself repeatedly in the head with his ski pole. Just when I thought things couldn't get much worse, nausea struck, wave after wave, like morning sickness, and I thought, I'm going to throw up in the snow. Ladies and gentlemen, now for my next trick. I pretended to pinch my nostrils against the cold, but was actually pressing my hand to my mouth to hold back the tide. My head spun, and I prayed, help me, Jesus, help me. The way a very old woman at my church named Mary used to pray at her most afraid and delirious, right in the middle of anything, sermons, songs. I don't know how long I stood there with my hand clamped to my mouth, only my poles and a frayed consignment store faith to support me. All I knew was that help is always on the way, 100% of the time. Rumi, the great mystic, said, someone fills a cup in front of us. And I know that when I call out, God will be near and hear and help eventually. Of course, it is the eventually that throws one into despair. Of course, for instance, even now I know America will be restored again, eventually, although it is hard to envision this at the moment. And it could take a century or more for the nation to recover from the George W. Bush years. But they will. God always hears our cries and helps, and it's always a surprise to see what form God will take on earth. Maybe a tall, strong man with a medical toboggan would be by soon. Or the two pretty women who had helped me earlier. Or Jesus in earmuffs. Instead, a short, plump woman pulled up on skis a few minutes later. She was wearing an orange cap and an official jacket from the ski resort. "I think I'm going to throw up," I said, so she wouldn't get too close. "Well, then let's just stand here for a moment," she said. She had acne and chapped cheeks and small brown eyes. "I think I might need help," I said, which is something I force myself to say every few years. "God, you landed so hard," she said. "I saw you from up above." "Great." I shook my head, bewildered, on the verge of tears. "Are you on the ski patrol?" I asked. "Sort of. I'm here to help in non-emergency situations like this. Why don't you come with me?" She stepped out of her skis and stood on my binding so that I could step out of mine. We picked up our skis and I trudged after her through the snow. We walked to a wooden 10-by-10 shack away from the lift and went inside. It had 2 long benches, a folding chair, and shelves laden with first aid equipment and water. There were 2 shabby windows through which you could see snowy pine trees outside. The woman poured me a miniature Dixie cup of water, but my face was so cold that I couldn't get my lips to work, and I dribbled water down my front. She took the cup away from me. "Let's take off your gloves first," she said, and pulled them off, as gently as if they were mittens connected inside my jacket sleeves with a string. She laid the gloves on the chair near the heater and pulled off her own. "Mine are nice and toasty," she said. "You can wear them for a while until yours warm up. I'll be back soon. There are only a couple of us working this spot today." She went outside. After a while, I stretched out on one of the benches and closed my eyes. The kerosene smelled like lacquer, and I kept feeling waves of nausea. My bones were cold. I could isolate the icy scent of pine trees that sneaked through the walls. Sometimes grace is a ribbon of mountain air that gets in through the cracks. I practiced concentrating between each contraction, between each wave of nausea, the way I did when I was in labor, savoring ice chips and apple juice between contractions. Miles from home, holed up in a deeply smelly hut, I had the old familiar feelings of separation from myself, from God, and from the happy, pretty people outside. I thought of the woman from the ski patrol with her small brown eyes. She looked like the monk seals that swim ashore in Hawaii to rest on the sand. The adult seals are 6 and 7 feet long, and they all look like Charles Lawton. The newest tourists on the beach think that they are dying and need to be rescued, but anyone who has been there even a day knows that they come on shore to rest. Pool workers from the beachside resorts always arrive with yellow safety tape and traffic cones to rope off a space for the seals to rest in. The first time I came upon one in the sand, I thought it was trying to make eye contact with me. I thought I was its last best hope of being saved. It had sand around its eyes and lots of shark scars. My guy Rory laughed and explained that the seals are perfectly fine, and when they are rested, they waddle back to the ocean. This is how I feel about the world much of the time when I am not feeling too far gone. Things are how they are supposed to be, all evidence to the contrary. Life swims, lumbers across the sand, rests, lumbers, swims, rests. I lay there on the bench immobilized. If I were a monk seal, I could have waddled up into a sitting position, slid off the bench, and pulled myself by my flippers back into the ocean. Rory once saw a mother monk seal teaching her pups how to rest by swimming up onto the sand for a while before slipping back into the caves. The 2 of them practiced over and over, then disappeared into the water. Remembering this made me miss Sam terribly. I felt discarded, and I needed for time to pass more quickly. I would be fine with life's contractions if they would simply pass when I am ready for them to, so I can be okay again and remember what, after all, we're doing in labor. Being human can be so dispiriting. It is a real stretch for me a lot of the time. I put my nose to a crack in the wall so I could smell the pine. I couldn't wait any longer for the ski patrol woman to come back. Where was she? She'd said. She was my only real friend, and I was such a mess. Her voice was gentle and kind. The psalmist wrote, "Oh, that today you would hearken to his voice and harden not your hearts." So I said, "Okay, fine," to God, and then noticed that I was much less of a frozen mess than I'd been earlier. This is a lot. I could have sat up, but I wanted the ski patrol person to see the full extent of my suffering. If she ever, in fact, returned. I thought of the people I know from church and political circles who are doing a kind of psychic ski patrol in the world, noticing when people are in trouble, refusing to look away, offering an ear and their own warm gloves to wear. 20 minutes later, my ski patrol woman did come back, rubbing her bare hands together. "How you doing?" she asked. At first, the enthusiasm in her voice worried me because she sounded as if we might now move on to calisthenics. But then I could tell that she knew I was fine, better, rested. I was peaceful. She was my own private pool worker, my own mother seal. I sat up and breathed in the fresh air from the open door. She gave me another Dixie cup of water, and I hoisted this one Germanically. She walked over to the heater and checked my gloves. "They're all ready to wear again if you'll give me mine back." I stood up. I felt like my old self, which is to say, creaky but okay. "I would take the chair down," she said, "unless you really, really want to ski." I really, really wanted to ski. I'd already had one great run down this very slope. She made a huge fuss over me when I left, as if I'd been in an avalanche or something. I pulled on my gloves and headed out onto the huge white ocean of ice. I glided and fell and got back up and skied little by little, the very best I could, all the way back down the mountain. Thank you. So, does anybody have any real questions? Sometimes the first one, as I said, can be embarrassing. That's why we pay extra for it. Yes.
So I'm wondering if you have any guidelines for using your work in preaching, like maybe how much we can use without it being a copyright violation.
How much of my work can you use in your own preaching without it becoming a copyright violation? You can totally help yourself to everything, and I don't even care if you attribute it. Anything you find that you like, that makes sense to you, just use it. Anything. Yeah. That's what it's there for. The function of freedom is to free someone else, and the function of feeling a little bit better is to help someone else get that same sort of feeling of getting back in the saddle. Yeah.
So you said you are less depressed now after writing your third book on faith. George Bush is still president. I'm wondering what...
The question is that I said I was less depressed after writing this third book on faith, yet George Bush is still president. And I know she said that with love. Because I've been in the South recently, and they will just say any old horrible thing, but then they say, I say that with love. So, well, if you came tonight, you probably know that I have a very, very ferocious political opinion on almost everything, and that I'm a left-wing activist, as well as being a devout Christian. So there are a lot of us. And Jim Wallace and Richard Rohr have been just instrumental in galvanizing the religious left, for which I'm deeply grateful. But two things happened that helped my spirits be lifted about the state of this country and made me feel hopeful again, which I actually do. The first was that I got to the point where I couldn't stand to be me anymore, hating George Bush. And in recovery, people always say the willingness comes from the pain. And I was in so much pain thinking about what had happened to the environment and to the most precious gift America has offered to civilization, which is the separation of church and state. I was so angry that I literally felt unstable a lot of the time. And so at my church, St. Andrew, services at 11. It's so easy to find. And I will be there Sunday, and I'm hoping to see a number of you too. There's a time in the service where people that are really struggling physically or psychiatrically or in any way at all come forward for extra help, or if their kids or their parents are in trouble. And I actually go up pretty often. There's usually only 2 or 3 people up there. But I started going up with intentionality. And it was to do some healing and to stop being part of this toxic water in which we all swim now. So I went up and I told my pastor, Veronica, I said, I just hate these guys so much. Dick Cheney and Donald Rumsfeld. Said, it's making me toxic. And she didn't say, well, you can't be that way and keep coming up here. Or she didn't say, you need to kind of, she didn't try to spackle me back together or, all she did was she heard me. And she said, it's so good you brought that up to us. And then what she does is she gets everybody around, and then she'll just give a kind of generic plea for prayer for the people who've come forth. So I started doing it every 2 weeks, and I got better. Then they got worse. And then they got much worse. And the whole administration started coming apart like a $2 watch, and it was good. And Clive James, the brilliant English writer, wrote a poem called The Book of My Enemy Has Been Remaindered. That's really worth looking up, because when they started tanking, I just started to feel hope again. And then we came to the midterms of November 2006. And I know a lot of extremely savvy left-wing activists and just political people like I am, and not one of them, including me, thought we would take back the Senate. We knew by then we would get the Congress, but the best you could hope for was 50-50. It looked like it would be 50-50, and then Dick Cheney, who I personally, and I say this with love, I consider him a war criminal, and he would get to cast the deciding vote, right? And so the night of the midterm elections, I wouldn't watch with anybody because I was so tense, and I got out all my favorite foods, which are like Cheetos and M&Ms and Mint Milanos, and I sat there with my animals really grimly while the results came in. And people would call in and check in with me. But I am not stupid. And I was not born yesterday. And I had been through the 2004 election where the exit polls had all made it seem like Kerry was a shoo-in. And it took me a week to be able to even talk about the election. And most of my friends, we literally did not talk about it for days. It was too stunning. We were like, it's like being next to a Buddhist gong, only not benevolent. It was like, and so I sat there just really grimly, like if the cartoonist Roz Chast with her little stick figure characters all and little by little, the first thing that happened was Lincoln Chafee lost in Rhode Island, and the polls that had come out 3 days before said he'd caught up, and that was really exciting. And the recent polls that said Menendez was going to lose in New Jersey, that he was really in trouble, and he won. And then the biggest thing was when Claire McCaskill won. I think it was in Missouri. Is that right? She was running against the incumbent, and Jim Talent, and what she did was she announced before he conceded, I was so panic-stricken when this happened. It was about 11 or 12 California time, because you don't do that. And I thought, we're going to be in so much trouble when Mom finds out, because the guy he didn't concede for a long time. So, and I've been in a good mood since. That's the second part of how come I have more hope. I can say I've had 3 bad days since early November, because something that simply couldn't have happened. The plates of the earth shifted. There is oversight. There is decency. There is accountability. Yeah.
So what do you think of Arnold Schwarzenegger?
So what do I think of Arnold Schwarzenegger? Well, I love Maria Shriver. The best thing about Arnold Schwarzenegger is Maria Shriver. Arnold and I are very rarely in agreement about much. He was really awful to the nurses and the teachers, and I believe this is even in the Bible, that when you go to heaven, the teachers and the nurses are going to get the best seats, right? They are going to be in the dessert room, right? And he behaved disgracefully, and it was only because of Code Pink, the women's peace movement, that the teachers and the nurses got, the help that they were seeking, which is, oh my God. Then he was closing the public libraries in Salinas, which is the poorest county, or one of them in California, surrounded by some of the richest people in California. And so in this book, there's a piece about this 24-hour emergency read-in a bunch of writers held. It was sponsored by Code Pink. If you don't know how to plug in as an activist, Google Code Pink. I mean, they are so on top of their game. Or Main Street Moms Oppose Bush, the mob, MMOB. I mean, if you want to do something, because if you need to do something, even St. Paul, the book thumper, who I have tiny problems with, because of his infinitesimal unresolved issues about women, St. Paul says faith without works is dead. And in recovery, we say you take the action and then the insight follows. So if you don't know how to get involved, registering voters or getting people to the polls or just doing the work that we used to call the common good when I was a child. There used to be this phrase called for the common good. Now see, I bet the young people have never heard that because no one says it anymore. But at any rate, Schwarzenegger, that was an awful thing, and he got shamed into keeping the attention got enough money. And the libraries are open. They're not open 5 days a week, and they're not open all day when they are open, but they're open a lot. They're really one of the few choices parents have to keep kids away from gang activity or the pre-gang stuff that goes on. Most of those families don't have computers. They use the computers at the library, and it's a bilingual library. And so Arnold. But now I think what he's doing, the two things he's done that I love are his work with the stem cell movement and the environmental movement. He's gotten very, very passionate about. I mean, the stem cell thing was making me crazy. That was one of my bad periods, but that was before I started going up to the altar. But when George Bush had all of his little snowflake babies on stage, and they were talking about the frozen embryos that were being thrown away because they were no longer needed, and he was calling them the youngest and most vulnerable Americans. I just felt like, take me now, Lord, Let me go be with the teachers and the nurses in the dessert room. But I'm very, very glad. You can be next. I'm very, very glad for the stance he's taken, which is to get a lot of money into the research, which is what it takes, and also what he's doing with the environment. He's really stood up to Bush. My friend Mark Childress, the great writer from the South, said he tried to adopt a snowflake baby, but it melted. Over here in the gray, yeah.
I've related to you for a really long time. I even have a son named Sam who's going to be 17 next month. One thing, though, I can't figure out, all of you really good writers say you have to write for a block of time every day. But before you get famous and self-supporting, how do you make a living and do that and take care of your kids?
That's a good question. All of us writers tell everyone they have to sit down for a chunk of time every day. But how do you do that before you're famous and rich? Now, I stopped having second jobs after operating instructions came out. I was always broke, and I was always critically well received, and I was always struggling. And you just at some point have to consider what it is you can give up to get this extraordinary thing inside you out, which is your stories, your version of things, your take on life. I mean, just to write down like little ornaments or little jewels, the stories of your children or grandchildren or nieces when they're little. I can promise you someday you're going to be amazed and grateful to whatever it was that gave you that nudge. I hope it's me tonight saying, just do it. What can you give up? Well, I know people, I used to teach for 10 years at Book Passage in Corte Madera, and people would always be explaining why they couldn't get any work done yet. And when they were going to start fulfilling the artistic gift they had and the longing to be part of the the culture storytellers and the healers. You know, like Barry Lopez said, sometimes we need a story more than food to stay alive. But they'd always explain why they couldn't quite get to it. They said, well, as soon as my husband retires, we're both going to have a lot more. As soon as this happens, I said, as soon as your husband retires, you're going to lose your mind because he's going to be around the house all the time, and you're going to have to be friendly all day now. And they'd say, as soon as I move out to the country, well, we're going to move to the country. And I'd say, it's never going to happen. It's an illusion that as soon as. It's like thinking if you lose weight, you're going to be okay. And that the self-love, the hardest thing to find, and the most revolutionary stance to live from of self-love. You think if you lose 10 pounds, you'll step into that. And you know what? If you don't love yourself at 150, you're not going to love yourself at 140. It's not the way it works. It's an inside job. So you have to get kind of tough with yourself if you want to be an artist. It's not convenient, and nobody wants you to be a writer. It's not in anybody's best interest for you to be a writer. I mean, first of all, they don't want you to tell their icky little stories. And that's why we have novels, though. And if they wanted you to write more nicely about them, they should have behaved better, is my policy. My policy is that every single thing that happened to you is yours. But you look at your day and you say, I'm going to Nautilus 5 times a week. Can I go 4? Can I go every other day? Well, this is how I stay thin. This is how I stay fit. It's like, that's fine. That's great, but I don't think at 80 you're going to go, thank God I went to the gym every single day. And then you're going to go, God, I always wanted to write. So you look at the rest. So you can give up Nautilus one day, Tuesday, say. And then you look at what you do at the 10 o'clock news. Everyone can give up the 10 o'clock news. The story on the 10 o'clock news is where the local fires are. So you can find that out in the morning by reading the newspaper. And what you do is you sit down for an hour, and all the critical voices, the bad radio station in your head will say, an hour isn't going to be enough. But see, everything inside of you is going to be internalized critical voices that need you to stay small, and the quieter the better. I mean, for all American women, for most American women, this has been true. And if you're a girl in America over the age of 12 and you're not furious, you really missed the boat, you know? And so all of the voices inside are saying, oh, don't say that, don't tell that. You said, we agree. Don't do that. Well, an hour, and then an hour's not going to do it. But an hour does do it. An hour will get you a page, and a page will get you 300 pages a year. And I don't write any more than I did when I was really totally broke. In fact, I used to write more because I had that, anxiety about how was I going to make ends meet. And the thing was, I was raised by a writer, and he really taught me that you're so lucky to get to write. It's not like something that you can feel martyred about, or that you get to feel anything but just amazement about, that you're actually a decent writer, that you have a gift, and you have a head for a story. Probably you love to read. Probably you were someone, like a lot of us here, who were shy or odd when we were little, and we were literally saved by chapter books, the way other people are saved by Christianity. That you would find a chapter book like Charlotte's Web or Stuart Little or Pippi Longstockings, and you would read it and you would go, whatever the equivalent of being 6 and saying, oh my God. You would go, oh my God. And it would be like you were saved, and you were safe because you could get lost in this world that someone had painstakingly created for you to step down into. And in that way of getting lost, we got found. So that's really all you have to offer someone else is your version, your truth. And I just think it's going to be painful if at 80 you didn't do it. So you talk to people and you say, you know what, we need to start getting a page done. Someone you like, who's smart and whose work you think might be good, and you say, let's just start getting a page done. It's like, let's start walking half an hour every day. And you do it with that same need, because if you want to write and you don't write, you won't be well. You'll feel defeated your whole life. You'll feel like you got slightly ripped off or things got away from you. And this is what you wanted to do, was to be in the literary world, be a reader and a writer, and talk to people about their art and your art. Have people that will tell you the truth. I have 2 people I can give my stuff to. And I don't need people to go, oh, God, this is great. It's like when you give your parents clay ashtrays when you're little. Honey, did you make this? I don't need that. I need people to say to me, this is going to be great. This story is going to be great. The first page did not capture my attention. You got to somehow get people to turn the page. That's the one real fly in the ointment. And people say, the first page didn't really interest me that much. But I'll tell you, when that woman in the red sweater arrives with the eggs and the oranges, I sat up, and then you had me. Or they'll say, you know what, it's great, but you know what, it's too long by a third. You have to go through and take out a third of it. And or else, and it's awful. And I don't take criticism well. I'm like clinically sensitive. And I can't handle any criticism, but I need it desperately. I need it as a writer. And so people say that, I go, okay, well, thank you. Well, we're not really friends anymore. But then I'm just deeply, deeply grateful. God, there's so little truth being told. And for you to be able to read someone's work, and it's so hard to say to someone, you know what, this one character, the entire time I felt was just a cardboard cut-up, like outside the movie theater, and no one could have a real relationship with a cardboard cutout. And it's really hard to say that, because all of us, when we finish writing something, you want to hand it to people, and you want them to go, oh my God, it's exactly right. It's so amazing because it's perfect. Don't change a word. And but if people said that, they're doing a disservice to you. It's like when you set boundaries with your kids and then you don't stick to them, you're injuring your children. And in that same way, it's an injury to not let safe and trustworthy people help you bring your work up to the level that it could conceivably reach. Okay. Oh, yeah.
You said that you're so sensitive to criticism, and yet you're so brutally honest. How do you allow yourself to write something where you might look bad, or the people you know might look bad, and then they're going to read it?
Can you hear the question that I'm so sensitive? Okay. The answer is I would never write anything that I knew a person would read and then feel awful about. And that I keep that as, that's my very, very strict boundaries. I'd never write a story about Sam unless I was positive he was going to be glad that I had captured it. I wrote one story about my mom in Traveling Mercies that really hurt her feelings. And I felt awful about that. And I had hoped that trying to tell the truth about our relationship and how much love there was, but how hard it was for us both. I thought that this would be something she'd say, oh, honey, I'm so glad. But no one's ever going to say, oh, honey, I'm so glad you told the truth about you and me and how we don't get along about half the time. No one's going to say that, and it really hurt her, and I'm glad I wrote it finally, because so many women have been in the relationship with their mother where they're fantastic daughters, and they really love them, but they have to protect themselves from their mothers because their mothers would gobble them up, like in a Maurice Sendak story, and the mother has needed the daughter to be the mother their entire life, and the daughter has become too well to do that anymore. And I wanted to tell that story, that I'd become too well to do that, and that I wasn't going to be doing any more really, really inauthentic things with my mother from then on, and I really didn't. And that was why I didn't scatter her ashes for a couple years after she died, because I wasn't going to do one more fake thing. And so I finally scattered her ashes when it was on my heart to gather our relatives around, her twin sister, my brothers, and all my cousins and nieces and nephews, and to scatter her 2 years, on her birthday 2 years after she died. It was so authentic, and it was the beginning of having a real relationship with her finally. So, but that one time I felt like you could make a case for that it cost someone else too much for me to tell that. But mostly I try not to. And then telling my own truth, like about my body or my butt or menopause or how I ski, which I also wrote about in Plan B. To me, by the time I can tell it as a story, I'm so comfortable with the material. I know by then that it's a universal story. It's about how hard it is to be human and how hard it is not to be good at things, and because I know the secret is that if you want to write, if you want to play the piano, you're not playing the piano so you can botch The Farmer in the Dell, or you're not playing, but you're going to have to botch it for weeks. And at some glorious moment down the road, you're going to be able to botch your favorite Beatles song. And that's how you learn to play Brahms. And the same is true with writing, and the same is true with all of this stuff we have to do to grow up. You know, this one thing that is just so painful to just grow up. And so when I tell something, believe me, I've told it to a bunch of friends, and that we've all really laughed at it. And I know everyone gets it. And I know that people will read it and go, oh yeah, me too. If people come up to me at readings, I'll just tell you, because it's so annoying. I hope no one was going to do that. And it's a certain kind of woman, though. And it used to be a certain kind of man who was with a certain kind of woman. And it would just get my goat. And what they would say was, well, you're so much prettier than the way you write about yourself. And it's always a woman who's prettier than I am. And but then I always say something that I think is really ugly and like that just makes Jesus like drink. And what I do is I say, I'm not writing about your experiences of me or my beauty. I'm writing about how hard it is in America to see how beautiful you are, if there's anything at all different about you. And but so I've decided that from now on I'm going to say one of two things. I'm going to say, oh, well, thank you, or I'm going to say, uh-huh. So that's the answer. Is that I'm by the time I've told it, you know, I've been talking about it with girlfriends or with my brother and boyfriend and people, and we're all going, this is so, you know. I can tell you one last thing. I'm going to go. My feet hurt. It's really true. I'm not just. And then I'll sign your books. But my Jesuit friend Tom Weston, who I've written so much about in all of my nonfiction, he told me something that is so great once. He said, this is what we're up against, the 5 rules of being an adult in America. The first rule is you must not have anything different or wrong with you. You must be able to pass in any circumstance. The second rule is if there is something different or wrong with you, you really have to get over it as quickly as possible. You really need to correct it. The third rule is that if you can't get over it or correct it, you should pretend that you have. That it's just not even an issue anymore. The fourth rule is that if you can't even pretend to have gotten over it or corrected the situation, you should not show up, because it's very painful for the rest of us. And the fifth rule is that if you're going to insist on showing up, you should have the decency to be ashamed. And that is what we are up against. And that is the struggle that almost everyone that I love, anyone I'd ever want to sit with, has been up against. If you've got it together and you're perfect and it always made sense and you felt that you and Earth were a good match, I really don't know what we would talk about. But if you feel different and odd and slightly like a Martian, and that you were left here without any operating instructions and you're just waiting for them to come back for you, it's like, come sit down, let's have a glass of water. So, and that's what I'm up as a writer. I know it's dicey and scary for women to be loud and big in the world, but I insist on the right to show up, and I refuse to be silenced anymore. And the other thing I heard this year, I heard that years ago, the thing that most changed me this year was an interview with Marianne Pearl, who was the wife of Danny Pearl, who was the Wall Street Journal writer who was killed in, was it Pakistan? In Pakistan. And she just had his baby. She had the baby she was pregnant with, and it's probably 3 years old now. And she said, happiness is an act of resistance. And she said, my daily happiness is the resistance to oppression and terrorism. And I think that's something that does not get enough attention, certainly in the Christian tradition. The insistence on joy, the insistence on silliness and playfulness and wasting time and staring off into space like a cat, thinking about what it means and who we are and how we are to live. So, thank you all so much for coming here tonight. I just loved it. Thank you.
Much easier. Right.